Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I work as an archivist at the State Historical Society, housed in a century-old building downtown. Most of my time is spent in the basement archives, organizing and cataloging documents from the state's early history. It's usually quiet work, just me, the soft hum of climate control systems, and rows upon rows of metal shelving filled with boxes of historical documents. The basement level is a maze of narrow aisles and tall shelves, lit by fluorescent lights that flicker occasionally. Most people find it creepy, but I've always felt comfortable there, surrounded by the peaceful presence of history. At least I did until the renovations began. The construction crew was updating the electrical system, which meant occasionally cutting power to different sections of the basement. During one of these outages, I was using a flashlight to find a specific box of documents when I heard someone whisper my name. I turned, expecting to see one of my colleagues, but the beam of my flashlight showed only empty aisles. Then I heard it again, closer this time, followed by the sound of paper rustling. Following the noise, I found myself in the section containing documents from the 1890s. A box had been pulled partway off its shelf, documents scattered on the floor beneath it. As I bent to pick them up, I noticed they all related to a single case: the disappearance of a young clerk named Thomas Murray, who had worked in this very building when it was the county courthouse. According to the papers, Murray had last been seen entering the basement archives late one night in 1893, carrying a stack of important legal documents. He was never seen again. The documents he'd been carrying, which contained evidence in a major corruption case, vanished with him. As I read this, the temperature around me dropped dramatically. My flashlight began to flicker, and I heard more rustling, accompanied by the sound of footsteps moving deeper into the archives. Against my better judgment, I followed. The sounds led me to a section of wall I'd passed hundreds of times before. But now, in the beam of my failing flashlight, I noticed something odd. A slight difference in the color of the bricks, forming a rough rectangle about the size of a doorway. The footsteps stopped. In the silence, I heard another whisper. They buried the truth with me. My flashlight died completely. In the darkness, I felt something cold brush past me and heard the distinct sound of brick scraping against brick. When emergency lighting came on a few moments later, I was alone with a pile of loose bricks at my feet, revealing a small space behind the wall. Inside, we found a skeleton wearing the remains of a 19th century suit, along with a leather satchel containing the long-lost documents. The papers proved that several prominent officials had been involved in a massive embezzlement scheme. Thomas Murray had discovered their crimes and paid with his life. After the discovery, I expected things to quiet down in the archives. Instead, they became more active. Now I often hear typing from ancient typewriters in empty rooms, or find relevant documents mysteriously placed on my desk when I'm researching difficult cases. The most remarkable incident happened when I was struggling to find information about an old land dispute. I'd been searching for hours when I heard that familiar whisper. Second row, third shelf, red box. Following the instruction, I found exactly what I needed. I've come to understand that Thomas Murray isn't the only spirit in our archives. Many former clerks, lawyers, and government workers seem to linger here, continuing their work even after death. They're not harmful. They're just dedicated souls who believe their jobs are too important to let a little thing like death stop them. Now when I work late, I'll sometimes talk to them, asking for help locating particularly elusive documents. More often than not, I'll hear shuffling in the stacks, followed by the soft thud of a box being moved, leading me exactly where I need to go. The other archivists think I'm lucky to have an uncanny knack for finding obscure documents. Only I know that I have help from the other side, from dedicated public servants who take their jobs so seriously that not even death could make them abandon their posts. They're still here, organizing, preserving, and protecting the truth, just as they did in life. I've been a nurse at Pine Valley Memorial for 15 years, but nothing compares to what happens on 2 West, our oncology floor. I usually work the night shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., when the hospital transforms into a different world. The fluorescent lights dim, visitors leave, and the halls become eerily quiet, except for the occasional sound of footsteps that don't belong to any living person. The first time I encountered something unusual, I was doing my midnight medications round. As I approached room 214, I heard piano music. This wasn't unusual in itself. We have a small piano in the patient lounge that family members sometimes play. But at midnight, the lounge should have been empty and dark. Following the sound, I found the lounge completely dark. Yet the piano was playing a gentle, soothing melody I didn't recognize. As I watched, the piano keys moved by themselves, pressed by invisible fingers. The music stopped abruptly when I turned on the lights. Later that night, Mrs. Henderson, one of our terminal patients, told me she'd been having trouble sleeping, but had dozed off while listening to that lovely piano music. She said it reminded her of her mother, who had been a concert pianist. When I checked her records later, I discovered her mother had died in the same hospital 30 years ago. That was just the beginning. We started noticing other things, call lights, that would turn on in empty rooms, specifically in rooms where patients were actively dying. When we'd respond, we'd often find the room temperature unusually warm and comfortable, despite the hospital's typically chilly atmosphere. One particularly busy night, I was the only nurse on the floor when 3 patients needed attention simultaneously. As I rushed to respond to the first call, I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder, steering me toward a different room. Following this unseen guidance, I found a patient in the early stages of a critical emergency, something I might have missed if I'd gone to the other room first. After stabilizing the patient, I noticed a scent of old-fashioned rosewater perfume, the kind my grandmother used to wear. Then I remembered this was room 220, where an elderly nurse had died of a heart attack during her shift back in the 1960s. According to hospital legend, she had been known for wearing rosewater perfume and her uncanny ability to anticipate which patients needed help most urgently. The most remarkable experiences happen with our dying patients. They often talk about seeing deceased family members or former nurses standing by their beds. One elderly man kept thanking Nurse Rose for adjusting his pillows and bringing him water during the night, though no nurse by that name worked on our floor. But the most extraordinary incident involved a young patient named Alice. She was terminal, and her family had been keeping vigil for days. One night, exhausted, they finally went home to rest. As I passed Alice's room during my rounds, I heard voices, a woman singing softly and a child laughing. Looking in, I saw what appeared to be a nurse in an old-fashioned uniform sitting on Alice's bed, singing and playing pat a cake with her. The nurse looked up at me and smiled, then faded away. Alice passed peacefully an hour later. When I described the nurse to some longtime staff members, they recognized her as Margaret Wright, a beloved pediatric nurse who had worked at the hospital in the 1950s. Over time, I've come to understand that in hospitals, the line between life and death isn't as clear as we might think. Some nurses are so dedicated to their patients that they continue their rounds long after their own deaths. We've learned to work alongside these phantom colleagues. They're particularly active during the night shift, when the veil between worlds seems thinnest. Now when I feel that gentle hand steering me toward a patient's room, or catch a whiff of rosewater perfume, I simply say, thank you. These spirit nurses have become part of our team, helping us care for patients in their own mysterious way. They remind us that nursing isn't just a job. It's a calling that, for some, transcends even death itself. The night shift can be lonely and overwhelming, but I'm never truly alone. Between the living nurses and our ghostly colleagues, we ensure that every patient receives care and comfort, whether from this world or the next. After all, in a place where life and death meet daily, perhaps it's natural that some caregivers choose to stay, continuing their sacred duty of easing suffering and providing comfort to those in need. When I was about 11, we lived on the outskirts of Millbrook, near where the suburbs fade into dense woodland. The forest behind our house was crisscrossed with hiking trails, and we'd often explore them on weekends. My older brothers sometimes had to take me along when they went adventuring, so they could keep an eye on me while our parents worked. One summer day, we were following our usual path along a dry creek bed when we came across something unusual. A deep sinkhole in the middle of the creek, like the earth had simply opened up. My brothers were joking about making me go down into it when we heard a tremendous crash about 1,000 feet away. The sound of a massive tree falling. Moments later, another crash followed. We froze, our hearts pounding. Then, acting on pure instinct, we ran, convinced that something was chasing us. Looking back now, it might have been natural causes. Old trees do fall. But something about those sequential crashes felt deliberate, as if something was trying to frighten us away from the sinkhole. But the memory that truly haunts me happened a few years later. My friends and I were climbing a steep hillside that led to one of our favorite paths. At the bottom was a rocky creek bed, and the climb was nearly vertical, somewhere between 70 and 90 degrees, with roots and clay providing handholds. The height was intimidating, about 150 feet up. I was nearly at the top when I lost my balance. In that terrifying moment, as I started to fall backward, I felt a firm hand press against my back, helping me regain my footing. Relieved, I reached the top and turned to thank whichever of my friends had helped me. But both my friends looked at me strangely when I expressed my gratitude. They said neither of them had done anything. They had been too far away to reach me. Yet I had distinctly felt that steady hand supporting me, preventing what could have been a serious fall. Looking back, I realize how that moment could have ended very differently. The hand that saved me felt real, solid, definitely not my imagination. It reminds me that sometimes our guardians aren't always visible, but they're there when we need them most. Years later, I learned that the area had been sacred ground to the native tribes who once lived there. They believed the forest was protected by spirit guardians who watched over travelers, particularly children. Perhaps what I encountered that day wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, but rather one of these ancient protectors, still fulfilling its duty to keep young ones safe in its territory. Now, as an adult, I sometimes take my own children hiking on those same trails. I tell them to be respectful of the forest and its unseen guardians. When they ask why, I tell them about the mysterious hand that saved me from falling, and about the strange crashes that warned us away from danger. They're growing up knowing that not all supernatural encounters are frightening. Sometimes they're reminders that we're watched over and protected, even when we think we're alone. The forest, with its ancient wisdom and hidden guardians, has taught us that some places retain their sacred nature, long after their original protectors have passed into legend. Every time we hike those trails, I silently thank whatever force reached out to save me that day. The forest still holds its mysteries, but now they feel less like threats and more like old friends, watching silently from the shadows, ready to help if needed. I was born August 23rd, 1992. My mother went into labor on the 21st, and the doctors delivered me at exactly 8:08 a.m., weighing 8 pounds, just as Hurricane Andrew ravaged the Florida coast. Perhaps being born during such a powerful storm marked me somehow, because strange things have followed me ever since. As an infant and young child, I suffered from terrible night terrors. Some of my earliest memories are of waking up screaming, my body covered in unexplainable scratches and bruises, seeing shadowy figures when I closed my eyes. The episodes stopped around age 8, and I almost forgot about them until I turned 13. That's when my mother and I began photographing old cemeteries for a historical preservation project. The moment we started this work, something awakened in me. I began to hear voices in these ancient burial grounds, not frightening ones, but whispers of stories and memories. I could sense whether we were welcome or unwanted in different sections of the cemeteries, and I developed an awareness of the varying strengths of the energies around us. This seemed to open a door within me. I started having strong premonitions about people and events. I could sense things about strangers, their joys, their sorrows, their unfinished business. But it wasn't until I started working as a bouncer at the River's Edge Tavern that things got really strange. One night, a man dressed like a Vietnam veteran approached me for a cigarette. He called me Leo, though my name is Michael, and gave me cryptic advice. When you go home tonight and lay your head down, ask yourself this: will you be standing against the dark at my side, or will you sacrifice others to save yourself? When I corrected him about my name, he just smiled and introduced himself as Gabriel. Then he vanished into the crowd. I tried to follow, but no one else remembered seeing him, though the bar wasn't particularly busy that night. Later, at another venue called the Iron Horse, a massive man dressed like a biker approached me. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, built like a warrior, with long silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He bought me a shot of whiskey and a beer, barely speaking over the music, but something about his presence was magnetic. What caught my attention most was the elaborate pistol on his hip, decorated with intricate engravings and a triple spiral symbol, the ancient Celtic triskel. When I mentioned that weapons weren't allowed in the bar, he laughed and said, "No worries, Michael. I'm just enjoying the music and wanted to meet you in person. Watch for me in the storm. I'll be riding the lightning." He walked outside, mounted a motorcycle that roared like thunder, and disappeared into the night. Shortly after these encounters, I was at a friend's house when they began playing with a Ouija board, despite my protests. All the lights in the house suddenly shattered, and a dark figure appeared across the street, causing the streetlights to flicker wildly. Then came a blinding flash of white light, and the figure vanished. But in my mind, I heard a clear message. The entity had been banished, but I would have to be the one to send it back permanently because I was marked. Now, I have recurring dreams of a man in a white suit with gold-rimmed glasses, drinking what appears to be molten gold from a crystal glass in a magnificent parlor. He plays chess with a woman in a gray pantsuit. I see visions of ancient battles and past lives, and sometimes I dream of that silver-haired biker riding through massive thunderstorms, lightning crackling at his back as he plunges into clouds of darkness, shouting about rejoicing in Valhalla. I've spoken with others who claim to understand what's happening to me. A woman who called herself Beatrice, the witch of the mind, told me I'm part of something larger, something ancient. But nobody can fully explain these experiences or why they're happening to me. The encounters continue, each one more vivid than the last. Sometimes I think being born during that hurricane marked me somehow, attuning me to forces most people can't perceive. Or perhaps these entities were always there, waiting for someone who could see them, who could understand their messages and their missions. I don't have all the answers, but I know these experiences are real. They've shaped who I am and how I see the world. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being prepared for something, if all these encounters are leading to some greater purpose. Until I understand it fully, I remain watchful, especially during storms, listening for the sound of supernatural thunder and watching for riders in the lightning. I have an identical twin sister, and we've experienced some strange connections that defy explanation. The most remarkable incident happened when she was flying from Sydney to Los Angeles. About an hour into her flight, the aircraft encountered severe turbulence, the worst she'd ever experienced. Food went flying across the cabin. Passengers were terrified, and the pilot came on the intercom to say that in his 20 years of flying, he'd never encountered anything like it. My sister, understandably frightened, had to endure this knowing she still had most of her journey ahead. I was on the East Coast at the time, sound asleep in my bed. Suddenly, I jolted awake at 3 a.m., gripped by an inexplicable sense of terror. Overwhelming anxiety seized me, and I knew with absolute certainty that something was wrong with my sister. I sat in my bed, heart pounding, feeling helpless and strangely enough nauseous. After about 10 minutes, the feeling gradually subsided. The fear ebbed away, replaced by a calm certainty that my sister was now safe. I managed to fall back asleep, though the experience left me unsettled. Hours later, once her flight had landed, she called to let me know she was back in the States. When I asked about her flight, she described the terrifying turbulence. It was awful, she said. The plane was shaking so badly, they had to strap everything down. Everyone thought we were going to fall out of the sky. I asked her what time it had happened. After calculating the time zones, we realized it was exactly when I had awakened in terror. She also mentioned feeling violently nauseous during the turbulence, matching my own inexplicable symptoms at the time. She told me that the plane had tried descending to a lower altitude to escape the turbulence, which had made her stomach turn, explaining the queasy feeling I had experienced thousands of miles away. The timing was perfect. My mysterious awakening coincided exactly with her moment of greatest fear. This wasn't the first time we'd experienced such connections, but it was the most dramatic. We've often known when the other was in distress, finished each other's sentences, or called each other at exactly the same moment. But this was different. This was a physical sharing of experience across thousands of miles. The incident made us research twin connections more deeply. We discovered numerous accounts of twins experiencing similar phenomena, feeling each other's pain, knowing when the other was in danger, even sharing the same dreams on the same nights. Scientists call it twin telepathy, though they struggle to explain how it works. Some suggest it's related to quantum entanglement, the idea that particles that once interacted remain connected regardless of distance. Perhaps, having shared the same womb, twins maintain some form of quantum connection. Others propose it's linked to shared DNA, creating a biological radio of sorts that allows twins to tune into each other's emotional frequencies. Whatever the explanation, our experience that night proved to us that the connection between twins goes beyond mere coincidence or close familial bonds. There's something deeper, something science hasn't yet fully explained. Now when people ask us about being twins, we're more open about sharing these experiences. Many twins we've talked to have similar stories, moments when distance seemed to disappear, when one twin's experience became viscerally real to the other. It's as if being a twin means always having a part of yourself in two places at once, always being connected to another soul in ways that transcend physical space. That night taught us that the bond between twins isn't just emotional or psychological. It's something profound and mysterious, a connection that defies our understanding of space and time. Sometimes I wonder if twins are nature's experiment with quantum entanglement on a human scale, a living demonstration that consciousness can somehow bridge any distance when the connection is strong enough. I've had several paranormal experiences throughout my childhood and adult life that remain unexplainable. I never thought my childhood home itself was haunted. My parents bought it new when I was just a toddler, but something about the land it stood on felt wrong. We lived less than a quarter mile from my father's cattle pasture, which had old wagon trails running through it. Though we couldn't prove it, We always believed they were original Oregon Trail ruts. The energy there was strange. The scenery would draw you in. But something always felt off about the place. The first incident I clearly remember happened when I was 13 or 14. I was home alone, a rare occurrence, as my older sister usually stayed with me. I was in my bedroom, listening to rock music at full volume, trying to hit the high notes in one of my favorite songs. Suddenly, through the music, I heard my sister's voice call out, "Hey," exactly the way she always did. I turned down the music and yelled back, "What?" expecting her to come tell me what she wanted. But she never appeared. Confused, I walked upstairs and looked around, calling her name. That's when I noticed the front door was still locked, and her car wasn't in the driveway. The second incident happened during my freshman year of college. I was visiting home, and my friend Marcus stopped by despite my protests about using a Ouija board. All the lights in the house suddenly shattered, and a shadowy figure appeared across the street, making all the streetlights flicker. Then came a blinding flash of white light, and in my mind, I heard a clear message saying it had taken it somewhere else. But I would have to be the one to send it back because I was marked. I began having vivid dreams after that. In one recurring dream, I see a man in an impeccable white suit wearing gold-rimmed glasses, drinking what appears to be molten gold from a crystal glass in a magnificent parlor. He plays chess with a woman in a gray pantsuit who never shows her face. I also started having dreams and visions of battles, of past lives, and of mysterious figures. One particularly vivid recurring dream features a massive man on a motorcycle, riding through tremendous lightning storms, laughing as he plunges into clouds of darkness, shouting about rejoicing in Valhalla. During my sophomore year, I spoke with a woman who claimed to be the leader of an organization called The 100. She introduced herself as Isabella, the Witch of the Mind. She shared insights about my experiences, but left me with more questions than answers. These encounters have continued throughout my life, each one more vivid and meaningful than the last. Sometimes I think the land itself marked me somehow, attuning me to forces most people can't perceive. Or perhaps these entities were always there, waiting for someone who could see them, who could understand their messages and their missions. I've never fully understood why these things happen to me, or what it all means. The experiences seem to be building towards something, but I can't see the full picture yet. All I know is that these encounters are real, and they've shaped who I am and how I see the world. Sometimes I wonder if being born on that particular piece of land, with its ancient wagon trails and hidden history, somehow connected me to something older and deeper than we normally perceive. As if the echoes of all those pioneers who passed through, all their hopes and fears and dreams, somehow imprinted themselves on my consciousness. Until I understand it fully, I remain watchful, especially during storms. I've learned to accept these experiences as part of who I am, even if I can't explain them. Perhaps some of us are simply more attuned to the invisible currents that run through this world, marked by forces we can sense, but never fully comprehend. The first hospital I worked at had a notorious unit that the staff called the Quiet Wing. It wasn't really a single room. It was a larger mini-unit with 4 beds and monitoring equipment that served as a high-acuity area. From the moment I started working there, I knew something was different about this space. The emergency call system would activate itself when no one was in the unit. Our biomedical team checked it multiple times and even completely replaced the system. But the phantom calls continued. Equipment would mysteriously malfunction, and personal items belonging to staff would vanish, only to reappear in unexpected places days later. But what really caught my attention was the temperature issue. Patients would frequently request transfers out of that unit because, regardless of the thermostat setting, certain areas would become inexplicably cold. It wasn't just slightly cool patients reported being able to see their breath. Even during the height of summer, when the rest of the hospital was almost uncomfortably warm. The most unsettling experience happened during my night shift. I was caring for Mrs. Sullivan, an elderly patient with dementia. During my rounds, she suddenly became agitated and asked me to close the door because of that tall doctor in the old-fashioned white coat who keeps watching her. I glanced toward the doorway but saw nothing. Still, the hair on my neck stood up, and I felt an unmistakable presence. The air grew heavy, and the monitoring equipment began to behave erratically, showing impossible vital signs before shutting down completely. Later that week, during another night shift, I was at the nurse's station when I heard footsteps in the empty unit. These weren't the usual sounds of a busy hospital. These were deliberate, measured steps, like someone doing rounds in old-fashioned, hard-soled shoes. When I went to investigate, I found all the monitoring equipment turned off, the chairs rearranged, and a strong scent of carbolic acid, an antiseptic that hadn't been used in hospitals for decades. Curiosity led me to research the hospital's history. During the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, this wing had served as an isolation unit. The head physician, Dr. Arthur Wells, had worked tirelessly to save his patients, often staying for days without rest. According to hospital records, he eventually succumbed to the flu himself, found slumped over a patient's bed during his rounds. The strange occurrences began to make sense. The phantom call lights, the moving equipment, the temperature changes. These weren't random paranormal events. They were the actions of a dedicated doctor, still trying to care for his patients. One particularly busy night, when we were severely understaffed and overwhelmed, something remarkable happened. I was rushing to respond to multiple calls when I felt a gentle but firm hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward bed 4. There, I found a patient in the early stages of cardiac arrest, something I might have missed if I hadn't been directed there at that exact moment. As I called the code and began emergency procedures, I caught a glimpse of someone in my peripheral vision. A tall figure in an old-fashioned white coat, nodding approvingly before fading away. Thanks to the early intervention, the patient survived. Now when new staff members complain about the strange occurrences in the quiet wing, I tell them not to worry. I explain that we have an extra set of eyes watching over our patients, a dedicated physician who takes his oath to do no harm. So seriously that not even death could stop him from making his rounds. The call lights still go off occasionally, and equipment still gets mysteriously rearranged. But I've come to see these as helpful hints rather than haunting incidents. Sometimes late at night, when the wing is quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors, I'll whisper a thank you to Doctor Wells, the room will grow slightly cooler, and I'll know he heard me still on duty, still watching over his patients, long after his final rounds should have ended. In a way, it's comforting to know that some healthcare workers are so dedicated to their patients that they continue their work even after death. It reminds me that nursing isn't just a job. It's a calling that, for some, transcends even the boundary between life and death. Story 41. The Medicine Woman. When I was 9 years old, I experienced something that changed my understanding of both life and death. We lived in a small village in the mountains of Copper Canyon, Mexico, where ancient traditions still held strong, despite the modern world's steady march forward. Our family of 14 lived in a modest cabin, using oil lamps and candles for light, and a giant wood-burning stove that my siblings and I would huddle around during the bitter winter months. My mother believed strongly in traditional medicine for every ailment. There was a corresponding herb or root that could be found in the surrounding forest. For upset stomachs, she'd brew yerba buena or epazote, bitter roots that seemed to cure anything. Clean intestines meant a healthy body, she'd say, administering castor oil 3 times a week. Looking back, I saw plenty of unusual things through our window that faced the dense forest. But that's another story entirely. In our village, there was a medicine woman who people called La Curandera. The villagers whispered that she charged extra pesos for her prayers, and 1 peso was worth its weight in gold back then, especially for a large family like ours. We also had a midwife, Doña Maria, who helped bring new lives into the world. I became terribly ill that winter. My mother tried everything, all her herbs, teas, and remedies, but nothing worked. I grew weaker by the day, and I remember seeing my mother quietly weeping as she held me, her warm tears falling on my face like rain. One night, as I lay in my bed, I saw something. In the corner of my room stood a dark figure. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out that it was wearing a long black lace dress with a black veil that covered its face. It just stood there watching me, unmoving. I wanted to scream, but couldn't find my voice. I tried to move, but my body felt impossibly heavy. The figure remained motionless, but I could feel its gaze upon me. The air in the room grew thick and cold. Days passed, and my condition worsened. The figure appeared more frequently now, always in the same corner, always watching. My father had begun measuring my body's length. He would be the one making my small coffin, as was tradition for fathers in our village. Then one day, through the fever and weakness, I heard a commotion among my parents. A new medicine woman had arrived in our village, and she was on her way to see me. This brought me a glimmer of hope, but the dark figure remained, now standing even closer to my bed. The medicine woman examined me, and though my family didn't believe in modern medicine, this beautiful German doctor represented our last hope. I didn't understand everything that was happening. My body was weak, and my mind confused. Was this all a bad dream? Was I not going to heaven anymore? In my altered state, I struggled to turn onto my right side, facing away from the paint-chipped wall. Through the window, I could see the sun casting its final rays through the dense trees surrounding our cabin. The curtains swayed gently in the evening breeze. The dark figure wasn't in its usual place. I called out for my mother in fear, and she came running. She was overjoyed to hear my voice, asking why I had screamed. I told her about the dark figure that had been watching me. She smiled and assured me no one was there. Mother told me later that they had almost lost me. I had been devastatingly ill and bedridden for nearly a month. The new medicine woman had saved my life with powerful medications. I had received 3 doses, though I didn't remember the needle prick strange, given my intense fear of needles. But the dark figure wasn't done with me. When my mother returned to the kitchen, it appeared again, standing in its usual corner. As always, it just watched, silent and still. I still felt weak, but somehow knew that I would survive now. Perhaps this entity had been waiting to see which way my fate would turn. The figure visited less frequently after that, and finally disappeared altogether. But the experience changed me forever. It taught me that sometimes the line between life and death is thinner than we imagine, and that there are beings who watch and wait at this boundary, their purposes unknown to us, who still walk in the world of the living. Last night, something entered my room. I woke up to a sensation of something settling over my face. At first, I thought it was just my bed covers, but something felt wrong. I reached up and grabbed what felt like fabric and threw it aside. When I reached for my bedside lamp, what I saw made my blood run cold. All of my clothes, which had been neatly folded in a basket, were now stacked on top of me from neck to toe. The piece of fabric that had been covering my face was a pair of my son's shorts. I froze, listening intently for any sign of an intruder in my home. After about 10 minutes of complete silence, I gathered my courage and got up to search the house. The only other person living with me was my 8-year-old son, and I found him fast asleep in his top bunk. I knew he couldn't have done this. His metal bunk bed was notoriously squeaky, and he would have made noise getting in or out. Besides, he's never been one for practical jokes. I searched every room, every closet, and every possible hiding place. No one was there but us. All doors were locked, all windows secured. But something had definitely been in my room. Something had taken my carefully folded laundry and arranged it on top of me while I slept. This wasn't the first strange occurrence in our house. Once I found a random puddle of water in the middle of the living room when no one had been home. There was no leak in the ceiling, no spilled glass, no logical explanation for its presence. Just a perfect circle of water on our carpet. The incidents always seem to happen when I'm alone or when my son is sleeping. Sometimes I hear footsteps in the hallway, but when I check, there's never anyone there. Objects move on their own, not dramatically flying across the room like in horror movies, but subtle movements. A book will be slightly out of place, or a picture frame will be turned just a few degrees. Most unsettling are the shadows I sometimes catch in my peripheral vision. They're always human-shaped, but too tall and too thin to be natural. When I turn to look directly at them, they're gone, but I can feel them watching me from just out of sight. The laundry incident was different, though more direct, more physical. Whatever is in our house seems to be growing bolder, more willing to interact. I've read that poltergeist activity often involves stacking objects, and this seemed to fit that pattern perfectly. But why my clothes? Why stack them on me while I slept? Was it trying to communicate something, or was it simply playing with me? The precision of the stacking was remarkable. The clothes were laid out as neatly as if I'd done it myself, each piece perfectly aligned with the others. My son hasn't reported seeing anything unusual, but lately he's been having nightmares he can't remember. He'll wake up crying, but can't tell me what scared him. I wonder if he's sensing whatever is in our house, even if he can't consciously perceive it. I've considered moving, but something tells me this entity isn't tied to the house. It feels more like it's attached to us, or maybe just to me. Would it follow us if we left? Would it grow angry if we tried to escape? For now, I've decided to stay. Not out of bravery, but because I feel like I need to understand what this thing wants. Is it trying to warn us about something? Protect us? Or does it have more sinister intentions? I've started keeping a journal of all the occurrences, noting dates, times, and any patterns I can detect. The activity seems to increase during the full moon and on particularly stormy nights. It's also more active when I'm stressed or upset, as if it feeds off negative energy. Tonight, I'll go to bed with my clothes safely locked away in drawers. Will it find something else to stack on me? Will it try to communicate in a different way? I don't know what to expect, but I know I won't be sleeping deeply. Sometimes I think I can hear it moving around in the darkness, rearranging my world in ways I don't yet understand. I have an identical twin sister, and throughout our lives, we've experienced connections that science can't explain. The most remarkable incident happened during a flight she took from Tokyo to Vancouver. About 2 hours into the journey, the aircraft hit severe turbulence, unlike anything she'd ever experienced. The plane was dropping and shaking violently. Meals went flying across the cabin. Passengers were screaming, and the captain announced that in his 25 years of flying, he'd never encountered turbulence this severe. My sister, usually a calm traveler, was terrified, knowing she still had 8 hours of flight time ahead. I was in Boston at the time, sound asleep in my bed. Suddenly, at exactly 3:17 a.m., I jolted awake in a cold sweat, my heart racing with inexplicable terror. An overwhelming sense of danger gripped me, and I knew with absolute certainty that something was wrong with my sister. I sat up in bed, fighting waves of nausea that seemed to come from nowhere. The feeling was so intense that I got up and paced my room, trying to shake off the anxiety. I even considered calling our parents, but what would I say? I have a feeling something's wrong with Rachel. They'd think I was being dramatic. After about 15 minutes, the feeling gradually subsided. The fear ebbed away, replaced by a calm certainty that whatever danger had existed was now past. I was able to lie down again, though sleep didn't come easily. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just experienced something significant. Hours later, when her flight landed, Rachel called me. Before she could say anything about her journey, I asked, "Did something happen on your flight?" Around 5 hours ago, there was a long pause on the line. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. She described the terrifying turbulence, how the plane had tried to climb above it, then had to descend rapidly when that didn't work. The rapid descent had made her violently nauseous. When we calculated the time zones, we realized that my sudden awakening had coincided exactly with her moment of greatest fear. The nausea I felt matched her own physical symptoms, despite us being thousands of miles apart. This wasn't the first time we'd experienced such connections. We often know when the other is upset or in danger. We frequently call each other at exactly the same moment, or start singing the same song despite being in different places. But this incident was different. This was a physical sharing of experience across vast distances. The episode led us to research twin connections more deeply. We discovered numerous accounts of twins experiencing similar phenomena, feeling each other's pain, knowing when the other was in danger, even sharing the same dreams on the same nights. Scientists call it twin telepathy, though they struggle to explain the mechanism behind it. Some researchers suggest it's related to quantum entanglement, the idea that particles that once interacted remain connected regardless of distance. Perhaps, having shared the same womb, twins maintain some form of quantum connection. Others propose it's linked to shared DNA, creating a biological frequency that allows twins to tune into each other's emotional and physical states. Whatever the explanation, our experience that night proved to us that the connection between twins goes beyond mere coincidence or close familial bonds. There's something deeper, something science hasn't yet fully explained. Now when people ask us about being twins, we're more open about sharing these experiences. Many twins we've talked to have similar stories, moments when distance seemed to disappear, when one twin's experience became viscerally real to the other. That night taught us that the bond between twins isn't just emotional or psychological. It's something profound and mysterious, a connection that defies our understanding of space and time. Sometimes I wonder if twins are nature's experiment with quantum entanglement on a human scale, a living demonstration that consciousness can somehow bridge any distance when the connection is strong enough. I was born during a rare convergence of events. It was August 23rd, at precisely 8 minutes past 8 in the morning, as an unexpected solar eclipse darkened the sky. The nurses later said they'd never seen anything quite like it. The moment I took my first breath, every light in the delivery room flickered and died. From my earliest memories, I knew I was different. As an infant, I suffered from terrible night terrors. My parents would find me screaming in my crib, my tiny body covered in inexplicable scratches and bruises. When I could finally talk, I tried to tell them about the shadows that moved behind my eyes, but they dismissed it as childhood imagination. The episodes stopped around age 8, and I almost forgot about them until my 13th birthday. That's when the visions started. I began seeing things others couldn't, not just ghosts or spirits, but glimpses of what felt like other realities bleeding into our own. One night, while working as a security guard at an old theater, I encountered a man dressed in Civil War-era military attire. He tipped his hat to me and said, "Time's growing short, soldier. The boundaries are wearing thin." Before I could respond, he walked through a solid wall and vanished. A week later, a woman in Victorian dress appeared in my apartment. She was writing in a leather-bound book and didn't acknowledge me at all. When I tried to speak to her, she looked up startled, as if she couldn't believe I could see her. "You're one of the marked ones," she said, before fading away like morning mist. The most significant encounter happened during a thunderstorm. A massive man, nearly 7 feet tall, appeared at my door. He wore ancient Norse armor and carried a hammer that crackled with electricity. He spoke in a voice like distant thunder. "The old powers are stirring. Those who bear the mark must prepare." I started having recurring dreams of a grand library where time didn't seem to exist. Books floated through the air, their pages turning by themselves. An elderly librarian in a white suit with gold-rimmed glasses would be there, drinking what looked like liquid starlight from a crystal glass. He never spoke, just smiled knowingly, and pointed to different books that contained glimpses of possible futures. During the day, I began noticing patterns that others couldn't see, symbols hidden in everyday objects, messages encoded in random occurrences. I could sense the energy of places and objects, feeling the echoes of events that had happened there or were yet to come. A woman who introduced herself as the keeper of records found me one day. She explained that certain individuals are born marked, sensitive to the layers of reality that most people can't perceive. These marks often manifest during celestial events, like my birth during the eclipse. She taught me that what I was experiencing wasn't madness, but a kind of attunement to the underlying fabric of reality. The shadows I saw as a child, the spirits and visions, were glimpses through the thinning veil between worlds. The keeper explained that the boundaries between realities are weakening, and those who bear the mark will be needed to help maintain the balance. She showed me how to control my abilities, how to distinguish between different types of visions, and how to protect myself from entities that might be drawn to my energy. Now I understand that being marked isn't a curse, but a responsibility. I serve as a kind of bridge between worlds, helping lost spirits find their way, recording visions of possible futures, and watching for signs of greater disturbances in the fabric of reality. The visions continue, becoming clearer and more frequent. The man in the white suit still appears in my dreams, his golden glasses reflecting scenes from other times and places. Sometimes he leaves books open to specific pages, showing me what I need to see. I've learned to accept these experiences as part of who I am. The mark I bear sets me apart, but it also connects me to something larger than myself. Through my visions and encounters, I've come to understand that reality is far more complex and interconnected than most people realize. Those of us who are marked serve as witnesses and guardians, keeping watch over the boundaries between worlds. We stand ready for whatever changes are coming, knowing that our ability to see beyond the veil exists for a purpose, even if we don't yet fully understand what that purpose might be. It was a quiet Tuesday night at the Copper Lantern, the kind of night where the regulars nursed their drinks and kept to themselves. I'd been tending bar there for about 6 months, and I thought I'd seen every type of customer there was. That changed when he walked in. He wore old military fatigues that looked authentic, but somehow out of time, like they belonged in a different decade. His eyes held a 1,000-yard stare that seemed to look through people rather than at them. When he approached the bar, the air around him felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. "Whiskey neat," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of command. As I poured his drink, I noticed his hands. They were calloused and scarred, but occasionally seemed to flicker, like a bad television signal. You can see it, can't you? He asked suddenly. The way things aren't quite solid anymore. Before I could respond, he continued, name's Marcus. Was a lieutenant in Nam. Still am, depending on which side of the veil you're looking from. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Time's getting thin, he said. The boundaries aren't holding like they used to. That's why you can see me when others can't. I looked around the bar. None of the other patrons seemed to notice him, their eyes sliding past his seat as if it were empty. The realization sent a chill down my spine. Tomorrow night, he said, around 2 a.m., don't go into the storage room. No matter what you hear, no matter who calls for help. The veil will be particularly thin then, and what comes through won't be friendly. He finished his whiskey in one smooth motion. Been watching this place for a while. Used to come here before shipping out. Lot of us did. Some of us still do, even if we never made it back. We try to keep an eye on things, warn people when we can. Standing up, he placed something on the bar, a weathered combat patch that looked decades old. Keep this with you. It'll help you see what needs to be seen and hide from what needs to be hidden from. As he turned to leave, he paused. One more thing when they start coming through more frequently, remember this. Iron repels, silver binds, and salt purifies. You'll need all three before long. He walked toward the door, his form becoming less distinct with each step. Just before he disappeared completely, he turned back. The war never really ended, kid. It just changed battlefields. Stay sharp. The next night, at exactly 2 a.m., I heard screaming coming from the storage room. Every instinct told me to help, but I remembered Marcus's warning. Instead, I locked the door and poured a line of salt across the threshold. The screams turned to inhuman howls, then silence. The combat patch now hangs behind the bar, next to my collection of iron horseshoes and silver charms. Sometimes late at night, I catch glimpses of soldiers from different eras sitting at the bar, standing guard against things that lurk just beyond our reality. Marcus still appears occasionally, usually to warn me about particularly dangerous nights. He never orders anything anymore, just nods in acknowledgement of our shared understanding of what really happens in the dark hours. I've learned that some veterans never stop serving, never stop protecting others, even after death. They stand eternal watch on a battlefield most people can't see, fighting enemies that exist just beyond the edge of normal perception. The bar has become something of a safe haven, a neutral ground between worlds. The regulars probably wonder why I keep so much salt on hand, or why I insist on maintaining the old iron fixtures. But they feel safer here, even if they don't know why. Marcus was right about one thing: the boundaries are getting thinner. More things are slipping through each night. But as long as the ghostly veterans keep their watch, and as long as people like me heed their warnings, we hold the line between our world and whatever waits on the other side. Late one stormy night at the Mountain View Tavern, I encountered someone or something that changed my understanding of reality forever. The bar was nearly empty, just a few regulars waiting out the storm when he walked in. He had to duck to clear the doorframe. He must have been close to 7 feet tall, with shoulders like a linebacker. His leather jacket and boots were ancient, but perfectly maintained, and his silver-white hair fell past his shoulders. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were the exact color of lightning and seemed to hold the same crackling energy. He moved with an impossible grace for someone his size, settling onto a bar stool that should have groaned under his weight, but remained eerily silent. A massive motorcycle helmet sat on the bar beside him, decorated with intricate Norse runes that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. "Whiskey," he said, his voice like distant thunder. "The good stuff." As I reached for the top-shelf bottle, I noticed something that made my hand freeze. Holstered at his hip was an elaborate pistol covered in strange engravings. At its center was a triple spiral symbol that seemed to move on its own. When I mentioned that weapons weren't allowed in the bar, he laughed, a sound that made the bottles behind me rattle. "Don't worry, little brother," he said. "I'm just passing through, checking on those who can see me. The storm's coming, and it's bigger than any of us expected." He drank his whiskey in one swift motion, then placed something on the bar, a silver coin covered in symbols I'd never seen before. "Keep this close," he said. "When the lightning rides and the thunder walks, you'll need it." Standing up, he towered over the bar. "Watch the skies," he said. "When you see me riding the storm clouds, you'll know it's starting." He turned to leave, then paused. "And when you hear thunder on a clear day, run. That's not me, that's them." He walked out into the storm, and through the windows, I watched him mount a motorcycle unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was massive, ancient-looking yet somehow advanced, covered in the same mysterious runes as his helmet. When he started it, the sound was like thunder compressed into a physical force. As he rode away, actual lightning seemed to gather around him, creating a corridor of electricity through which he and his mysterious machine disappeared. The moment he vanished, every light in the bar exploded, leaving us in darkness split only by the natural lightning outside. The next morning, I examined the coin he'd left. In daylight, the symbols were clearer. They formed patterns that reminded me of weather maps, but for storms that haven't happened yet. Sometimes, late at night, I catch it humming softly, particularly when storm clouds are gathering. I've seen him 3 more times since then, always during the worst storms. Once, during a particularly violent thunderstorm, I saw him riding actual lightning bolts between clouds, his mysterious motorcycle leaving trails of electricity in the sky. The last time he appeared, his message was more urgent. "They're breaking through more often now," he said. "The boundaries are weakening. Watch for signs, static electricity where there shouldn't be any, thunder without storms, lightning that moves against the wind." He wouldn't explain who they were, but the grip on his strange weapon tightened when he spoke of them. "Just remember," he said before leaving, "not all thunder means I'm coming, and not all lightning is natural. If you see black lightning, run. If you hear thunder that sounds like laughter, hide. And if you see me riding the storm, stay inside. That means war has come to the sky." The coin he gave me grows warmer during storms now, and sometimes I swear I can hear distant motorcycle engines in the thunder. I've learned to watch the weather more carefully, to distinguish between natural lightning and something else, something older and more dangerous, moving through our skies. They say lightning never strikes the same place twice, but I've learned that's not true. Some lightning isn't lightning at all. It's a road, a weapon, or a warning. And somewhere out there, riding the electromagnetic arteries of our world, that mysterious biker continues his eternal patrol, protecting us from things that hide behind the storms. I've been having recurring dreams about a mysterious figure, but I'm not entirely sure they're just dreams anymore. It always starts the same way. I find myself in an impossibly vast library, its shelves stretching up into darkness. The walls are lined with ancient leather-bound books, and floating orbs of soft golden light illuminate the space. In the center of this library stands a magnificent mahogany desk, and behind it sits a man in an impeccable white suit. His eyes are hidden behind gold-rimmed glasses that seem to reflect scenes from other times and places. He's always drinking something that looks like liquid starlight from a crystal glass, the fluid shifting and swirling with its own inner light. The first time I saw him, he was playing chess with a woman in a gray pantsuit. I never saw her face. She seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to look directly at her. The chess pieces moved by themselves, and I realized they weren't playing an ordinary game of chess. The pieces represented real people, real events. "Ah, you're finally here," he said that first night, his voice carrying echoes of countless other voices. "We've been expecting you. Please sit. Would you like a drink?" It's quite literally time in liquid form, distilled moments from particularly interesting centuries. I sat in the offered chair, watching as his drink swirled with images. I saw battles and celebrations, births and deaths, all swirling in that mysterious liquid. The chess pieces continued moving on their own, each move seeming to trigger ripples in the air around us. "You're wondering if this is real," he said, adjusting his golden glasses. "It's as real as anything else, perhaps more so. This library exists between moments, in the spaces where time folds back on itself. We collect possibilities here, catalog what might have been and what still could be." He showed me books that wrote themselves, their pages filling with events as they happened. Other books contained multiple versions of the same event, each one playing out differently. "Time isn't as linear as most people think," he explained. "It's more like a library. All moments exist simultaneously, and sometimes the shelves get a bit disorganized." In subsequent visits, I've watched him sorting through timeline threads like colored strings, carefully weaving them into complex patterns. Sometimes he reads from books that haven't been written yet, or shows me photographs of events that haven't happened. The woman in gray appears occasionally, though she never speaks directly to me. They seem to be playing an endless game of chess with reality itself, moving pieces that affect events in our world. Sometimes I catch glimpses of familiar faces on the chess pieces, people I know, people from the news, people who haven't been born yet. During my last visit, something was different. The library seemed darker, the books more restless on their shelves. The man in white was standing by a window that showed a storm I've never seen in our world, lightning of impossible colors, thunder that sounded like breaking glass. "The boundaries are wearing thin," he said, not turning from the window. "Reality isn't as stable as it used to be. That's why you can see this place now. You're one of the ones who can perceive the cracks forming in the walls of the world." He turned to me then, removing his glasses for the first time. Behind them, his eyes were galaxies, swirling with stars and cosmic dust. "We need observers," he said. "People who can see what's coming and remember to warn others. That's why we brought you here." He handed me a book bound in white leather. "Write down everything you see, especially in your waking life. When you notice things that don't quite fit, patterns that shouldn't be there, write them down. The records must be kept, even if nobody believes them." I keep that book by my bed now. Sometimes new words appear on its pages without my writing them. And sometimes my own writings rearrange themselves into different stories. The man in white still appears in my dreams, though less frequently now. I've learned to watch for signs in my waking life, moments where time seems to stutter, places where reality feels thin. I write everything down in that white book, knowing that somewhere in that impossible library, the man in white and the woman in gray are moving their chess pieces, playing out possibilities that will shape our world. Story 48. The hospital unit. I've been a nurse for 20 years, and I thought I'd seen everything until I started working in Unit 4 West at Memorial Hospital. It wasn't really a single room. It was a larger mini-unit with 4 beds and monitoring equipment that served as our high-acuity area. From day one, something felt different about this space. The emergency call system would activate itself when no one was in the unit. Our biomedical team checked it multiple times and even completely replaced the system, but the phantom calls continued. Equipment would mysteriously malfunction, and personal items belonging to staff would vanish, only to reappear in unexpected places days later. But what really caught my attention was the temperature issue. Patients would frequently request transfers out of that unit because, regardless of the thermostat setting, certain areas would become inexplicably cold. It wasn't just slightly cool. Patients reported being able to see their breath, even during the height of summer, when the rest of the hospital was uncomfortably warm. One night, while doing my rounds, I had my first direct encounter. I was checking on Mrs. Patterson, an elderly patient with dementia, when she suddenly became agitated. "Please tell that doctor in the old-fashioned white coat to stop staring at me," she said. "He's been standing there for hours." I looked toward where she was pointing but saw nothing. Still, the hair on my neck stood up, and I felt an unmistakable presence. The air grew heavy, and the monitoring equipment began to behave erratically, showing impossible vital signs before shutting down completely. Later that week, during another night shift, I heard footsteps in the empty unit. These weren't the usual sounds of a busy hospital. These were deliberate, measured steps, like someone doing rounds in old-fashioned, hard-soled shoes. When I went to investigate, I found all the monitoring equipment turned off, the chairs rearranged, and a strong scent of carbolic acid, an antiseptic that hadn't been used in hospitals for decades. Curiosity led me to research the hospital's history. During the 1918 influenza pandemic, this wing had served as an isolation unit. The head physician, Dr. William Thompson, had worked tirelessly to save his patients, often staying for days without rest. According to hospital records, he eventually succumbed to the flu himself, found slumped over a patient's bed during his rounds. The strange occurrences began to make sense. The phantom call lights, the moving equipment, the temperature changes. These weren't random paranormal events. They were the actions of a dedicated doctor, still trying to care for his patients. One particularly busy night, when we were severely understaffed and overwhelmed, something remarkable happened. I was rushing to respond to multiple calls when I felt a gentle but firm hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward bed 4. There, I found a patient in the early stages of cardiac arrest, something I might have missed if I hadn't been directed there at that exact moment. As I called the code and began emergency procedures, I caught a glimpse of someone in my peripheral vision, a tall figure in an old-fashioned white coat, nodding approvingly before fading away. Thanks to the early intervention, the patient survived. Now, when new staff members complain about the strange occurrences in Unit 4 West, I tell them not to worry. I explain that we have an extra set of eyes watching over our patients, a dedicated physician who takes his oath to do no harm. So seriously that not even death could stop him from making his rounds. The call lights still go off occasionally, and equipment still gets mysteriously rearranged. But I've come to see these as helpful hints rather than haunting incidents. Sometimes, late at night, when the unit is quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors, I'll whisper a thank you to Dr. Thompson. The room will grow slightly cooler, and I'll know he heard me still on duty, still watching over his patients, long after his final rounds should have ended. My childhood home in rural Mexico held secrets that still haunt me today. It was a sprawling hacienda-style house, built in the 1800s, where my family of 14 lived a simple but comfortable life. Being the youngest of 12 children, I often found myself alone exploring the house's many rooms and corridors. Strange things began happening when I was around 9. My mother, deeply superstitious and well-versed in traditional remedies, had always warned us about certain areas of the house. She'd place crosses above doorways and burn sage in corners where the shadows seemed too dark. The first incident I clearly remember happened during a fierce thunderstorm. I was alone in my room when I noticed something moving in the corner. There stood a figure wearing a long black lace dress and a veil that completely obscured its face. It didn't move or speak. It just watched me with an intensity I could feel through the veil. I wanted to scream, but couldn't find my voice. I tried to move, but my body felt impossibly heavy. The figure remained motionless, but I could feel its gaze upon me. The air in the room grew thick and cold, and time seemed to stop. Days passed, and I became seriously ill. My mother tried everything, all her herbs, teas, and traditional remedies, but nothing worked. I grew weaker, and the figure appeared more frequently, always in the same corner, always watching. My father had begun measuring my body's length. He would be the one making my coffin, as was tradition for fathers in our village. Then one day, through my fever and weakness, I heard excitement in the house. A new doctor had arrived in our village, a German woman who practiced modern medicine. This was rare in our remote area, and though my family was traditional, they were desperate enough to try anything. The doctor examined me and began treatments, but the veiled figure remained. It stood closer to my bed now, and sometimes I thought I could hear it breathing. The room would grow so cold during these visits that my breath would fog in the air. One evening, I managed to turn onto my right side, facing away from the paint-chipped wall. Through the window, I could see the sun casting its final rays through the pepper trees surrounding our house. The curtains swayed gently in the evening breeze. For a moment, the figure wasn't in its usual place. Frightened, I called out for my mother. She came running, overjoyed to hear my voice. When I told her about the figure that had been watching me, she went pale. Without saying a word, she left the room and returned with copal incense and holy water. She spent the next hour praying and cleansing the room. Mother later told me that they had almost lost me. I had been devastatingly ill and bedridden for nearly a month. The German doctor's medicine had saved my life, though I had no memory of receiving the injections. But the figure wasn't finished with me. After my mother left, it appeared again, standing in its corner. This time, though, something was different. Instead of just watching, it raised what looked like a hand, pointing toward the window. Outside, a massive white owl sat in the pepper tree, staring directly into my room with eyes that glowed like amber. Years later, I learned that in Mexican folklore, white owls are sometimes seen as harbingers of death. Some believe they accompany La Muerte herself when she comes to collect souls. Perhaps what I saw wasn't just a spirit, but death itself, waiting to see which way my fate would turn. The figure began appearing less frequently after that night, and eventually stopped altogether. But the experience changed me forever. Sometimes when I'm very ill or troubled, I catch a glimpse of black lace in dark corners, or hear the soft rustle of a veil. And always, without fail, there's a white owl watching from the nearest tree. I've come to believe that some places, like our old hacienda, exist closer to the boundary between life and death. In such places, entities like my veiled visitor can watch us more easily, waiting to see which souls they might need to guide to the other side. That time they decided to let me stay, but I know they're still watching, still waiting, ready to appear again when my time truly comes. When I was around 8, strange things started happening in our Victorian-era home. At first, it was small things. Toys would move on their own. Doors would open and close without explanation. And sometimes, we'd hear the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the empty halls. My parents tried to rationalize everything. The moving toys were just the house settling. The doors were due to drafts, and the laughter was probably just the wind. But I knew better. I could feel someone or something watching me, especially at night. The first clear encounter happened during a thunderstorm. I woke up around midnight to find a young girl, maybe 6 or 7, sitting at the foot of my bed. She wore an old-fashioned dress with a pinafore, her dark hair tied back with a ribbon. She seemed solid at first glance, but when lightning flashed, I could see right through her to my bedroom wall. Instead of being scared, I felt strangely calm. "Hello," I said softly. She turned to look at me, her face sad but gentle. "I'm Emily," she said, her voice sounding like distant wind chimes. "I used to live here. Will you play with me?" That was the beginning of an unusual friendship. Emily would appear most nights, usually after my parents had gone to bed. We'd play quiet games with my toys, or she'd tell me stories about what the house was like when she lived there in the 1890s. Sometimes she'd show me secret places in the house, a hidden compartment behind the library shelves, a small door in the attic that led to a forgotten storage space filled with Victorian-era toys. When I showed these discoveries to my parents, they were amazed, having lived in the house for years without finding them. Emily seemed happiest when we played with her old toys that we found in that hidden attic space. She especially loved a porcelain doll with a cracked face, which she said had been her favorite. Sometimes, while playing, she would become so solid that she almost seemed alive again. But there were sad moments too. Sometimes she'd sit by my window, looking out at where a garden had once been, now replaced by a driveway. She'd tell me about the flowers her mother used to grow, and how they'd have tea parties among the roses. One day, curious about my friend's history, I convinced my parents to research the house's past at the local historical society. What we found broke my heart. Emily Harrison, age 7, had died of scarlet fever in our house in 1893. The records included a family photograph, and there she was, my ghostly friend, standing with her family in front of our house, holding the very same cracked porcelain doll we'd found in the attic. When I told Emily I knew about her death, she didn't seem surprised. "I know I'm not alive anymore," she said quietly, "but I don't want to leave. This is my home, and now I have a friend again." As I grew older, Emily's visits became less frequent, though she never completely disappeared. She seemed to understand that I was growing up, moving on to different interests and friends. But sometimes, late at night, I'd still hear her laughing or singing softly in the hallway. The last time I saw Emily clearly was the night before I left for college. She appeared in my room, looking exactly as she had that first night. "I'll miss you," she said, "but don't worry about me. Other children will come, and maybe they'll want to play too." Years later, my parents still live in that house, and they often tell me about hearing children's laughter, especially when their grandchildren visit. My young niece has mentioned playing with a girl in an old dress, who shows her secret places in the house. I've learned that not all ghosts are scary, and not all hauntings are malevolent. Sometimes spirits remain behind simply because they're attached to a place they loved, waiting for someone who can see them, who can share in their memories and their games. Emily taught me that death doesn't always end a friendship. It just changes its nature. Somewhere in that old Victorian house, a little girl still plays with her favorite doll, waiting for the next child who might want to share in her eternal game of make-believe. My family moved to Arizona from Mexico in 2008, seeking a better life in the United States. With barely any possessions and 7 people to house, we ended up renting a tiny place on the outskirts of Phoenix. The house was all we could afford. Just 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a modest kitchen, and a cramped living room. My parents, Antonio and Maria, took 1 bedroom with my sisters Carmen and Rosa, while my 3 brothers Miguel, Rafael, Thomas, and I shared the other. Living in such tight quarters wasn't easy, especially in the desert heat, but we made it work. My parents worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table, while we kids attended the local school, slowly adapting to our new life in America. Despite the challenges, there was a sense of hope in those early days, until the strange occurrences began. It started one ordinary night when I had to use the bathroom. The house was silent, except for the gentle hum of the window air conditioning unit. As I walked down the short hallway, I heard something fall in the darkness. Given how many siblings I had, I assumed one of them had knocked something over and paid it no mind. After finishing up and washing my hands, I decided to investigate the noise. What I found sent chills down my spine, despite the summer heat. Isabella, my sister, was standing motionless in the corner of her room, staring intently at the wall as if transfixed by something invisible to everyone else. When I asked what she was doing, she didn't respond or even acknowledge my presence. "Hey, I'm talking to you," I said, my voice wavering slightly. She suddenly snapped out of her trance-like state and turned to me with pure terror etched across her face. Before I could ask what was wrong, she started screaming for our mother. The sound pierced the quiet house like a knife, sending me scrambling back to my parents' bed in fear. They jolted awake, asking what was happening. Still shaken, I could only shrug as they told me to go back to bed. But instead of leaving, I lingered outside their door, listening intently to the conversation within. Through the thin walls, I could hear Isabella sobbing as she described what she'd seen. A woman in a black dress, standing beside two children who appeared to be severely burned. My parents tried to dismiss it as a nightmare, but Isabella insisted she had been wide awake. The fear in their voices when they exchanged glances told me they weren't as skeptical as they pretended to be. The incidents continued. A few nights later, Isabella's screams once again echoed through our house. This time, she claimed the woman had tried to grab her. She described going to use the bathroom when she spotted the burned children in the corner. Then the woman appeared from the hallway, not walking, but floating towards her with an outstretched hand. Just as the spectral fingers were about to touch my sister, all three figures vanished into thin air. My mother, despite her attempts to rationalize the events, grew increasingly anxious. The look of genuine terror on Isabella's face convinced her this was more than just an active imagination. She had Isabella sleep in their room and called the local priest the next day to bless our house. For a while after that, things seemed to calm down. Then one afternoon, a pipe burst under the house. My father had to crawl into the cramped space beneath the foundation to fix it, bringing my brothers along to help. None of us was prepared for what we found in that dark, musty crawl space. The moment I ducked under the house, an inexplicable chill ran through my body. The beam of my flashlight revealed dozens of candles scattered across the dirt floor, some red, some black, all covered in strange symbols and dried wax. "They're probably just old candles someone left behind," my father said, though his voice betrayed his unease. Then Miguel called out that he'd found some books. Dad told him to bring them outside where we could see them better. Once the pipe was fixed, we emerged into the sunlight to examine Miguel's discovery. The books were filled with drawings of what appeared to be ritual ceremonies, pentagrams, and writings in languages none of us recognized. My father's face went pale as he flipped through the pages. He quickly gathered up the books and showed them to my mother, who immediately insisted they be burned. As we watched them go up in flames, doused in gasoline in our backyard fire pit, we couldn't help but wonder if they were connected to what Isabella had been seeing. That night, the screaming started again. This time, Isabella said the woman was furious that we had burned her books. My parents stayed up with her until dawn, then took her to church first thing in the morning to seek the priest's counsel. His advice was unequivocal. We needed to leave that house as soon as possible. But before we could move, Isabella had one final encounter. She was in the bathroom when the woman materialized out of thin air and spoke to her directly, asking for a favor. She wanted my father to open and clean out the old chimney that had been sealed with bricks. My parents called my uncle to help with this strange request the next day. When they opened the bottom of the chimney, they found nothing. But when they removed the bricks from the top, a gust of wind nearly knocked my father off his ladder. Strange, given it was a perfectly still day. Inside, they discovered something chilling: bones and ashes. Terrified, my father sealed the chimney even more thoroughly than before, using concrete to ensure it would never be opened again. That was the final straw. My uncle offered to let us stay with him while we searched for a new place, and we packed up and left the very next day. Within a month, we had found a new house in a different part of town, and the haunting experiences ceased. Isabella never saw the woman or her burned children again. Looking back now, I often wonder about the previous owners of that house and what dark rituals might have taken place there. The books, the candles, the bones, it all pointed to something sinister. While our time in that house was brief, the memories of those terrifying nights have stayed with us. A reminder that sometimes the American dream can lead you down unexpectedly dark paths. My mother told me this story when I brought up the idea of using a Ouija board to contact my younger brother, who had recently passed away. Her experience was enough to make me never want to touch one of those boards in my life. It happened during her final year of high school in rural Idaho, where endless fields of wheat stretched toward the mountains. One crisp autumn night, she and 5 friends were driving along the dusty back roads in an old pickup truck, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They were looking for adventure, that particular brand of teenage rebellion that comes from being young in a place where nothing ever happens. The abandoned Miller farm caught their attention, a weathered barn standing stark against the starlit sky, its wooden boards warped and graying with age. The perfect spot for some late-night excitement. As they pulled up to the property, their headlights illuminated the broken windows and creeping ivy that had claimed the structure as its own. One of the girls, Katie, produced an old Ouija board from her backpack. My mom immediately felt uneasy about the whole thing. There was something about that place, she said, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. But when everyone started calling her a coward and insisting the board wouldn't work unless everyone participated, she reluctantly agreed with one condition. No creepy questions, she insisted. Nothing about death or darkness. The boys laughed and promised to keep things light. They gathered in a circle on the barn's wooden floor, their flashlights creating elongated shadows that danced across the walls. The musty scent of old hay and rotting wood filled the air as they placed their fingers on the planchette. They started with simple questions. Is anyone here? What's your name? The usual things teenagers ask when they're half believing, half skeptical. The planchette remained still, and my mom began to relax, thinking perhaps this would just be another boring night in Idaho. Then Terry, always the troublemaker, broke their agreement. Which one of us will be the first to die? He asked with a smirk. My mom immediately pulled her hands away from the board. That's not funny, she snapped, genuine anger in her voice. The others yelled at her to put her hands back, insisting they couldn't break the connection. When she reluctantly returned her fingers to the planchette, something changed in the atmosphere. The temperature seemed to drop, and the flame of their camping lantern flickered despite the still air. The planchette began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. It spelled out 2 letters, JP. Jason Parker, one of the twins present that night, tried to laugh it off, but the sound caught in his throat. His brother Jordan gripped the planchette tighter, his knuckles white in the dim light. The group quickly said goodbye to whatever they'd contacted and packed up the board. The drive home was silent, each person lost in their own thoughts about what had happened. Years passed, and the night at the Miller farm became just another story, something to occasionally reminisce about at reunions. Then came the news that shattered their small community. Jason Parker, now working as a local mechanic, had been driving his truck along those same back roads late one night. His vehicle had suddenly veered off the road and rolled several times before coming to rest in a wheat field. The investigation revealed something chilling. Someone had deliberately loosened the lug nuts on his front wheel. The police suspected foul play, but no suspects were ever identified. Jason Parker became another tragic statistic, another life cut short on rural Idaho's dangerous roads. But those who were there that night in the barn never forgot how the Ouija board had spelled out his initials, how it had known, years in advance, that he would be the first to go. My mother's voice still shakes when she tells this story, and I notice she always makes the sign of the cross when she finishes, something she only does when truly rattled. I never did try to contact my brother through a Ouija board. Some doors, Mom taught me, are better left closed, some questions better left unasked. Because sometimes, in the darkness of an old barn or on a lonely country road, you might get an answer you're not prepared to live with. Growing up in rural Louisiana, our house sat on land that once belonged to an old plantation. The massive oak trees draped with Spanish moss seemed to whisper stories of the past, their branches casting strange shadows across our worn wooden porch. I was 14 when my youngest brother Lucas, barely 4 at the time, started talking about his new friend. At first, we didn't think much of it. Plenty of kids have imaginary friends. But Lucas was different. He was also an active sleepwalker, which made his nighttime adventures all the more unsettling. He would describe his friend Josiah as a tall man with dark skin who wore tattered clothes and loved to tell stories about hunting in the bayou. Lucas said Josiah taught him about the old ways of surviving in the swamps, which plants could heal and which would harm, how to listen to the birds for warnings of danger. I would often hear Lucas talking in his room, his young voice engaged in what sounded like a real conversation. When I would peek in, he would be sitting cross-legged on his bed, looking up at an empty corner of the room, nodding and responding to questions I couldn't hear. Sometimes he would laugh at jokes that weren't being told. His small face lit up with genuine joy. One day, Lucas told our mother something that made her drop the plate she was washing. He said Josiah used to live nearby in a small cabin, but the white folks burned him alive when they found out he was teaching other slaves to read. The detail in his story was chilling. How could a 4-year-old make up something so specific, so historically accurate for our area? The incidents escalated when my middle brother Michael returned from visiting our father for the summer. The day before he came back, Lucas told Mom and me that Josiah doesn't like it when Michael is mean to me. He's going to teach him a lesson. We didn't think much of it at the time, just the words of a little boy who didn't always get along with his older brother. That night, we heard a scream that still haunts my dreams. We ran upstairs to find Michael standing in his room, white as a sheet, swearing that his bed had been shaking violently. The strange thing was, Lucas was sound asleep in his own room, peaceful as could be. It was a bunk bed they shared, but Michael swore the whole structure had been rattling like it was in an earthquake. A month later, tragedy struck. Lucas was playing in the backyard when he fell and hit his head on an old stone well cover. The injury was severe, a fractured skull that required immediate surgery. During his recovery in the hospital, he never mentioned Josiah again. It was as if his supernatural friend had vanished, along with his memories of that terrible day. But the strange occurrences didn't end there. When Lucas was about 12, he started getting mysterious phone calls in the middle of the night. Always between 2 and 3 in the morning, his cell phone would ring. When he answered, he would hear what sounded like static mixed with screams, like an old recording played through damaged speakers. This went on for weeks. We tried changing his number, switching phone companies, even getting him an entirely new phone. The calls followed him. When he tried to trace the numbers, they led nowhere, one time to an elderly man who had no idea what we were talking about, another time to a disconnected line. Just when the calls were becoming unbearable, they suddenly started coming to our home phone instead. One night, Mom got a message that made her skin crawl, the same static-filled screaming we'd heard before. When we tried to trace that call, the number was listed as disconnected. After that, the calls stopped completely. Years later, during a renovation of our property, workers discovered the remains of an old cabin foundation near where our garage now stands. Among the ruins, they found charred wood and, more disturbingly, burned books, primers, and readers from the mid-1800s. The local historical society confirmed that the area had indeed been part of a plantation, and there were records of a slave uprising that ended in bloodshed. Sometimes on quiet nights when the moon is full and the Spanish moss sways in the breeze, I think about Josiah. Was he a protective spirit drawn to my innocent little brother? Or was he trying to warn us about something we still don't understand? Lucas is in college now, studying history with a focus on civil rights. He doesn't remember Josiah anymore, but sometimes when he's home visiting, I catch him staring at that corner of his old room, as if some part of him still remembers the friend who once told him stories of the bayou. The summer before everything changed, Grandpa Billy taught me how to fish in the crystal clear waters of the Deschutes River. He was the kind of man who could tell you exactly where the fish were hiding, just by looking at the way the water moved. His weathered hands would guide mine as we tied intricate fishing knots, his patience never wearing thin despite my clumsy fingers. That's why when they told us he had pancreatic cancer, it felt like someone had pulled the world out from under my feet. I was 13, old enough to understand what cancer meant, but young enough to believe that someone as strong as my grandfather couldn't possibly lose this fight. The adults tried to shield us from the reality of his condition. but I could see the truth in their forced smiles and whispered conversations. My parents did their best to maintain a sense of normalcy, assuring my sister Lizzie and me that Grandpa Billy was doing just fine. They'd take us to visit him every morning, where he'd still tell his favorite fishing stories, though his voice grew weaker with each passing day. Even in his hospital bed, he maintained that mischievous twinkle in his eyes, especially when sharing tales of his younger days as a forest ranger in the Cascade Mountains. Then came that morning, a cool Oregon dawn that seemed ordinary in every way. I had this strange dream that felt different from any other. Grandpa Billy appeared, not sick and frail as he had become, but strong and vibrant like he was during our fishing trips. He stood in what looked like our favorite spot by the river, sunlight dancing on the water behind him. He didn't speak, but smiled warmly and waved goodbye, his gesture carrying all the love and wisdom he'd shared throughout my life. The dream was so vivid that when I woke up, I could still smell the pine trees and river water. My sister Lizzie was already awake, which was unusual for her. She sat on the edge of her bed, looking confused and slightly shaken. Before either of us could speak, we heard Dad's car pulling into the driveway. He had been at the hospital for the night shift of what we called Grandpa Watch. But something was different this morning. Our dog Scout, a loyal Australian shepherd who always slept under Grandpa's hospital bed during visits, was acting strange. He had gone with Dad last night, as usual. Now, as Dad's car approached, Scout let out a long, mournful howl, a sound I'd never heard him make before and never heard again. Later, we learned that Grandpa Billy had passed away at 7:30 that morning, the exact time I had seen him in my dream. What's more, Lizzie confessed she had experienced a similar dream. We hadn't told each other yet, but somehow we both knew. It was as if Grandpa Billy had found a way to say goodbye to both of us before leaving. Dad shared something else with us later. He said that in those final moments, Scout had crawled out from under the bed and stood at the far side of the room. As Grandpa Billy took his last breath, Scout had let out that same haunting howl we heard when Dad came home. The nurses said they'd never heard anything like it. Years have passed since then, and I've grown to understand that some connections transcend the physical world. Sometimes, when I'm fishing in that same spot on the Deschutes, I can almost feel Grandpa Billy's presence, in the rustle of pine needles, in the gentle flow of the river, in the way the morning light catches the water just so. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right, I swear I can hear him chuckling as I fumble with my fishing line, still trying to master those knots he taught me so long ago. Scout lived for many years after that, but he never returned to the hospital. Whenever we'd drive past it, he'd press himself against the car door, as far away from the building as possible. It was like he knew something about the threshold between life and death that we couldn't understand, something he'd witnessed in that room with Grandpa Billy. I've experienced many things since then that I can't explain, but nothing has ever felt as real, as meaningful, as that final goodbye. It wasn't scary or unsettling. It was a gift, a chance to see my grandfather one last time, strong and whole, the way I'll always remember him. Sometimes love finds a way to bridge even the widest gaps, even if just for a moment, even if just in a dream. The house stood on Queen Anne Hill, One of those classic Seattle craftsman homes with dark wood trim and a wraparound porch. Built in the 1920s, it had weathered nearly a century of Pacific Northwest winters. Its green paint faded to a subtle sage. This was where my friend Ethan Gray lived with his 4-year-old daughter Sophie, making the best of life as a single dad after his wife's departure 2 years ago. The house wasn't grand, just a modest 2-bedroom with wooden floors that creaked beneath your feet and windows that rattled when the wind blew in from the sound. Ethan, being a practical software engineer, usually brushed off the house's quirks as typical old house behavior. The occasional unexplained footsteps, the random cold spots, the doors that would close on their own. He had a logical explanation for everything. Sophie, however, saw things differently. Like many young children, she had what seemed to be an imaginary friend. She would spend hours in the small den where her toys were kept, having animated conversations with someone she called Lily. Ethan would work from home, keeping an eye on her through the open door while she played in the corner. One day, curiosity got the better of him. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" he asked, watching his daughter giggle at something unseen. Sophie looked up with those innocent blue eyes of hers. "I'm asking Lily if she wants to come to my house to play with me," she exclaimed cheerfully. When Ethan asked where Lily lived, Sophie just shrugged and said, "I don't know." Then, pointing to an empty space in the room, she added, "But she's right there, Daddy. Can you take pictures of us?" Ethan, being the supportive father he was, played along. He pulled out his phone, wanting to encourage his daughter's imagination. The first few photos were just of Sophie, smiling and posing. Then he started taking burst shots, trying to capture her natural laughter as he joked with her. "Tell your friend to smile too," he said playfully. That's when something changed. Sophie's expression became suddenly serious, almost unsettlingly so for a 4-year-old. "Daddy," she said solemnly, "Lily never smiles." The way she said it sent chills down Ethan's spine. Later that evening, after Sophie was in bed, he was going through the photos, deleting the extras from the burst shots. That's when he saw it. In one of the pictures, there was something behind Sophie. A faint, translucent figure of a young girl in what appeared to be a Victorian-era dress. The figure was partially transparent, but clear enough to make out her features. And true to Sophie's words, she wasn't smiling. Ethan showed me the photo when I visited the next day. I'd known him since college, and I'd never seen him so shaken. The image was unlike anything I'd seen before, not the usual orb or lens flare that people often mistake for supernatural phenomena. This was clearly a child, probably around 8 or 9 years old, wearing clothes from another century. We did some research into the house's history. It turned out that in the late 1800s, before the current house was built, the property had belonged to a wealthy merchant family. They had lost their daughter, named Lillian, to scarlet fever. The family had moved away shortly after, unable to bear living where their daughter had died. The strange thing was, Sophie had never heard this story. She was too young to learn about the house's history, and Ethan had only discovered it after the photo incident. Yet somehow she had known the girl's name, or at least a version of it. After the photo incident, more things began happening around the house. Items would move on their own, particularly Sophie's toys. Sometimes they would be arranged in peculiar patterns when no one had touched them. The temperature in the den would drop suddenly, even on warm days. And occasionally, when Sophie was playing alone, you could hear two distinct children's laughs, Sophie's bright, living giggle, and another that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. But the most convincing evidence came one rainy afternoon when I was visiting. Sophie was napping upstairs, and Ethan and I were having coffee in the kitchen. Suddenly, we heard the unmistakable sound of children playing, two sets of footsteps running upstairs, two voices giggling. We rushed up to check on Sophie, only to find her sound asleep in her bed, alone. The activity never felt threatening or malicious. If anything, it seemed like Lily was simply happy to have a friend to play with after so many years alone. Ethan eventually came to accept the unusual situation, grateful that his daughter had found a companion during this difficult transition in their lives. As for Sophie, she still talks about Lily, though less frequently now that she started preschool and made more living friends. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the evening light filters through the old windows, you can still hear the faint sound of children's laughter echoing through the halls. A reminder that friendship can transcend even the boundaries between life and death. The winter sunlight in Vermont has a way of making everything look like an old photograph, all muted colors and long shadows. That's how I remember the day my grandparents first showed us their new house. A sprawling Victorian perched on a hillside overlooking Lake Champlain. Grandma Martha and Grandpa Howard had bought it for what seemed like a steal in the mid-1980s, eager to transform the aging property into their dream retirement home. The house itself was an architectural wonder, despite its deteriorating condition. From the road, you climbed a set of stone steps to reach the main entrance. But from the lakeside, both stories were visible, creating an imposing facade. The previous owners had added a second-floor indoor pool, an unusual feature that made the house stand out among its more traditional neighbors. My family moved in while renovations were still underway. The sound of power tools and workmen's boots echoed through the halls during those first few weeks. But there were other sounds too, ones that couldn't be explained by construction work. Strange things started happening almost immediately. Drills would suddenly kick into high gear despite being unplugged. Tools would vanish, only to reappear in bizarre locations days later. The house had 13 bathrooms, an odd number that always made me uncomfortable. But it was bathroom number 13 that held the most unsettling energy. It featured an unfinished, state-of-the-art shower system from the previous owners, its chrome fixtures gleaming dully in the half-light. During one of my tour, while explaining the house's features to a group of visiting relatives, I heard a distinct shriek echoing down the hallway from the direction of the switchback staircase. When I asked if anyone else had heard it, they all nodded nervously. None of us could explain what made that sound. My bedroom was located beside the stairs on the second floor, and it quickly became clear that something wasn't right about it. The lock on my door would engage itself repeatedly during that first year. One particularly frightening incident involved my friend Katie and me getting locked inside. The fire department had to rescue us through the window. After that, my father removed the doorknob entirely, leaving me with an odd circular hole where it should have been. I later learned that my grandfather had invited a priest to bless the doorway, placing crosses above my sisters and my doors. At the time, I never questioned their presence, but now I understand why they were there. My mother would sometimes stand in the hallway outside my room late at night, watching, though she never told me what she was looking for. One of my most vivid memories involves sitting in the kitchen with my grandmother late one night. She was sewing pillows for the formal living room sofa while we chatted about life. She had just finished and stacked 4 pillows neatly on the counter when something inexplicable happened. The pillows suddenly flew across the kitchen, as if thrown by invisible hands, landing crumpled against the laundry room door that led to the basement. The basement itself was another source of unease. Late one night, when I was 11, I lay in bed listening to the silence of the sleeping house. Around 11 p.m., I heard a rhythmic tapping on my window. The sound started softly, but grew increasingly insistent. When I finally gathered the courage to look, I saw a tall, lean humanoid figure with an elongated head and 3-fingered hands tapping on the glass. Remember, this was on the 2nd floor. I screamed loud enough to wake the dead and ran to my mother's bedroom. She checked my room, but found nothing unusual. My grandfather and uncle searched the entire property, but discovered no evidence of an intruder. I didn't sleep in my room for a week after that incident. As I grew older, I switched bedrooms to escape the unsettling experiences. My new room had a walk-in closet where my grandmother stored linens and old family heirlooms. The closet had a latch on the outside that made it impossible to open from within. One afternoon, when I was about 14, I heard a thunderous bang from inside the closet, followed by the sound of someone or something desperately trying to break down the door. The activity seemed to escalate over time. One afternoon, I returned from school to find my mother standing frozen on the stairs, pale as winter snow. When she could finally speak, she told me she had been watching television in her room when she heard a loud bang. Looking up, she saw the Shadow Man, a dark figure we'd all glimpsed at various times, floating outside her 2nd-story window. We ended up leaving that house about 17 years ago, but its memory lingers. Even now, my dreams sometimes take me back there, and I wake up with that same feeling of unease that used to follow me through those haunted halls. The neighbors later told us they were confident something tragic had happened on that property, though no one seemed to know exactly what. Recently, while exploring some old photographs, I found a picture of that house from before we moved in. In one of the 2nd-floor windows, there appears to be a figure standing there tall, lean, with an unnaturally long head. It's probably just a trick of the light, a reflection or shadow playing across the glass. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder about that figure and all the others that shared our home during those strange years by the lake. The autumn of 2005 found me studying history at a small college in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The campus itself was steeped in Civil War history, with some buildings dating back to the 1800s. Our particular interest centered on Founders Hall, the oldest building on campus, where 2 of my friends had experienced disturbing phenomena. Jake would get inexplicable nosebleeds in one specific classroom, while his girlfriend Emma often became disoriented and anxious in that same space. I was dating Rebecca at the time, an art history major who was deeply interested in Victorian spiritualism and the occult. Through her, I met Cassandra Wilson, a self-proclaimed medium who carried herself with an air of mysterious authority. Our group expanded to include Liam, who claimed to have experienced paranormal activity since childhood. One crisp October night, when the moon hung full and heavy over the campus's Gothic spires, someone suggested we conduct a séance in the notorious classroom. The idea took hold quickly, despite my reservations. We purchased a glow-in-the-dark Ouija board from the town's Walmart. Something about its modern commercialism seemed almost sacrilegious, given our historic surroundings. The classroom was on the third floor of Founders Hall, its tall windows overlooking the battlefield, where thousands had died nearly 150 years ago. The autumn wind whistled through the building's old bones as we set up our amateur séance. 6 of us gathered around the board: Rebecca, Cassandra, Jake, Emma, Liam, and myself. We began traditionally, holding hands in a circle around the board and inviting any spirits present to communicate. The planchette remained still at first, our fingers resting lightly upon it in the dim light of battery-operated candles, real ones being prohibited in the building. The only sound was our breathing and the occasional creak of the ancient floorboards. Then something changed. The planchette began to twitch, subtle movements at first that grew increasingly deliberate. It moved in patterns that made no sense until Jake, who was taking notes, began arranging the letters in columns. Before we could decipher the message, Cassandra's body went rigid. What happened next still haunts my nightmares. Her eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and her body began convulsing violently. But it was the sound she made that truly terrified us, deep, guttural noises that seemed impossible for a human throat to produce. They weren't just pig-like squeals, as some have suggested. They were something far more primitive and disturbing. Cassandra began crawling toward the door in a manner that seemed to defy natural movement. Her limbs twisted at impossible angles, her head jerking spasmodically. When Jake tried to prevent her from reaching the stairwell just outside, it took 4 of us to restrain her. Even then, her strength seemed superhuman. All the while, the planchette was moving frantically across the board, spelling out nonsense that later proved to be Latin phrases written backward. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and we all experienced an overwhelming sense of malevolent presence. The episode ended as suddenly as it began, but none of us could shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. We huddled together in my off-campus apartment above an old pizza shop, trying to make sense of what we'd witnessed. The Ouija board, which I distinctly remember throwing into a dumpster that night, somehow appeared under my bed years later when I was packing up my parents' house. But the story doesn't end there. Several weeks later, we decided to try another session, this time just Rebecca and me. The energy was different, immediately heavier, more oppressive. The planchette spelled out my name, and suddenly the atmosphere shifted dramatically. It began rapidly moving between A and Z, almost flying off the board with its violence. No matter what we asked, it continued this frantic pattern. The temperature would plummet whenever we tried to communicate, and we began to hear scratching sounds within the walls. We ended the session, but the strange events continued. Doors would open and close on their own. Objects would move without explanation. And most disturbing of all, we began to hear voices speaking in what sounded like ancient languages. The final session proved to be our undoing. Rebecca insisted on trying one more time, hoping to understand what was trying to communicate. The board spelled out my name again, followed by a series of numbers that, when decoded, formed geographical coordinates for a location on the battlefield. The planchette then began spelling out painful, repeatedly, before launching into its now familiar A to Z pattern. Research later revealed that those coordinates marked the spot where a field hospital had stood during the battle, a place where hundreds had died in agony. The Historical Society's records showed that the building we'd been using had served as a morgue during that period. Years have passed since those nights in Gettysburg, but their impact lingers. Rebecca eventually transferred to another school, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Jake and Emma broke up shortly after, both citing nightmares about their experiences. Cassandra refused to ever conduct another séance, claiming that something had attached itself to her that night. As for me, I've never touched a Ouija board again. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that strange scratching sound in my walls, and I wonder if whatever we contacted in that old classroom is still trying to communicate, still trying to tell us something about the pain and suffering it witnessed so long ago. The old Port District of Portland stands as a testament to Maine's maritime history. Its cobblestone streets and brick buildings weathered by centuries of salt air and winter storms. My best friend Olivia Davis bought one of these historic homes, a narrow 3-story townhouse with a widow's walk that overlooked Casco Bay. The real estate agent had praised its authentic 19th century charm, but failed to mention its other, more ethereal resident. The house itself was a perfect example of federal-style architecture, with its red brick exterior and 6/6 windows. Built in 1842 by a successful ship captain, it had survived the Great Fire of 1866 that destroyed much of Portland's waterfront. Inside, the original hardwood floors creaked beneath your feet, and the walls still bore their original horsehair plaster. Olivia, being a marine biologist, was drawn to the home's nautical heritage. She spent her first months there restoring the period details, stripping layers of wallpaper, refinishing floors, and carefully preserving the elaborate ceiling medallions. But it was during this renovation that the strange occurrences began. At first, it was just little things. The sound of footsteps on the 3rd floor when she was alone, doors that would close by themselves, the occasional giggle echoing through empty rooms. Olivia initially dismissed these as quirks of an old house, the way skeptics often do. But then her 4-year-old daughter Sophie started talking about her new friend. "Hannah likes to play with my dolls," Sophie would say, pointing to her Victorian dollhouse that had come with the home. She says they used to be hers. The dollhouse itself was a masterpiece of 19th century craftsmanship, with tiny furniture and delicate wallpaper that matched the house's original decor. I was there the first time we actually saw Hannah. Olivia and I were sorting through some old photographs we'd found in the attic, sepia-toned images of the house and its previous inhabitants. Sophie was playing with the dollhouse in the corner of the room when suddenly the temperature dropped dramatically. The autumn sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to dim, and there, reflected in the dollhouse's tiny windows, we saw her. She was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, wearing a high-collared dress with her hair in long braids. But what struck me most was her expression, a mixture of loneliness and hope, as she watched Sophie play with her old toys. When Sophie looked up and waved at her, Hannah smiled and waved back before fading away like morning mist. Research at the local historical society revealed that Hannah Matthews had lived in the house during the 1870s. She was the ship captain's granddaughter, who died of scarlet fever just before her 10th birthday. Her parents had donated her dollhouse to the house's next owners, unable to bear the sight of their daughter's favorite toy. After that first sighting, Hannah became a regular presence in the house. She seemed particularly active during stormy weather, when the fog rolled in from the bay, and the foghorns moaned their mournful warning to ships at sea. Sophie would often be found playing games that children hadn't played in over a century, singing songs that hadn't been popular since Victoria was queen. One evening, during a particularly fierce nor'easter, I stayed over to keep Olivia and Sophie company. The wind howled around the house's corners, and rain lashed against the windows. Sophie was already in bed when we heard music coming from the 3rd floor, the tinkling notes of a music box playing a melody I didn't recognize. We climbed the stairs to investigate and found Sophie's room filled with a soft, golden light. The dollhouse had been rearranged, its tiny furniture placed to host what appeared to be a tea party. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, happily chatting with thin air. But in the dollhouse's miniature mirrors, we could see Hannah sitting across from her, pouring imaginary tea from a tiny silver pot. Hannah says this is how they used to have tea parties, Sophie explained matter-of-factly. She's teaching me proper manners. The formal language seemed strange coming from a 4-year-old's mouth, but somehow entirely appropriate for the moment. Over time, we came to understand that Hannah wasn't a malevolent spirit. She was simply a lonely child who had found a friend in Sophie. She never appeared to adults directly, preferring to make her presence known through reflections, shadows, and the occasional rearrangement of Sophie's toys. The only exception was during thunderstorms, when we would sometimes catch glimpses of her standing at the windows, watching the lightning illuminate the bay as she must have done in life. Olivia eventually embraced her home's supernatural resident, even going so far as to restore Hannah's old bedroom to its original condition, using photographs from the Historical Society as reference. The room became a favorite play space for both girls, one visible, one not, and the sound of their laughter often filled the house during rainy afternoons. Years have passed, and Sophie is now in middle school. She doesn't play with the dollhouse as much anymore, but sometimes, when the fog rolls in and the house grows quiet, you can still hear the faint sound of a music box playing on the 3rd floor, and catch a glimpse of a small figure in an old-fashioned dress, waiting patiently for her friend to return to play. The Connecticut shore has its share of haunted houses, but none quite like the sprawling Queen and Victorian my family called home for 15 years. Perched on a rocky promontory overlooking Long Island Sound, its weather-worn shingles and elaborate gingerbread trim painted in shades of slate and midnight blue earned it the local nickname, the Storm Watcher. The house had a peculiar layout thanks to its position on the sloping ground. From the street, you entered on what appeared to be the first floor, but the back of the house revealed another full story dropping down toward the water. The result was a rambling structure full of unexpected staircases, odd-angled rooms, and windows that caught the restless light off the waves. My parents, Robert and Diana Summers, bought the house when I was 6, enchanted by its maritime character and the price that seemed too good to be true. Now, at 21, I understand why the previous owners were so eager to sell. But back then, it just seemed like an adventure. A huge old house with plenty of space for me and my younger brothers, Tyler and James, to explore. The first sign that something was amiss came during the initial unpacking. Strange things started happening immediately. Protected doors opening by themselves. The grand entrance creaking open, as if welcoming invisible guests. My parents attributed it to the coastal winds and old hardware. But even then, I felt something watching us. The patio doors leading to our bedrooms became a particular focus of activity. My brothers and I would wake to see a man walking back and forth, peering through the French doors as he passed. He never seemed threatening, more like a watchful presence making his rounds. What made it particularly unsettling was that all 3 of us saw him independently, and our descriptions matched perfectly. But the man was just the beginning. A darker presence lurked in the downstairs hallway, something that made all 3 of us take the stairs 2 or 3 at a time to escape its oppressive energy. I had recurring nightmares about struggling to reach the top of those stairs, while something grabbed at my ankles from below. In one particularly vivid dream, I was inches from safety when a hand clamped over my mouth, silencing my screams. My parents, both respected physicians, tried to maintain their skepticism, but even they couldn't ignore the increasing intensity of the phenomena. The door to my bedroom would slam shut in the early morning hours, with such force it would wake my father. He insisted it was just a draft, even though no other doors in the house behaved similarly. They eventually placed a heavy brass doorstop against it, but even that would somehow move during the night. I later discovered that my father had actually called in a priest to bless our doorways. The crosses that appeared above our bedroom doors weren't just decorative. They were protective measures taken by parents who were beginning to question their rational worldview. After I moved away to college, my father lived alone in the house for 2 years following my parents' divorce. That's when things escalated. He told me that when he'd come home from his hospital shifts, entering through the basement, the space would reek of pipe tobacco, a very specific, sweet blend. The scent would be overwhelming, but only in the basement and only at night. He'd go upstairs and come back down as a test, only to find the smell completely gone. The most terrifying incident happened during my senior year of high school. I was lying in bed watching the shadows on my wall when I felt an inexplicable sensation of dread. The darkness in my room seemed to deepen, and I became aware of a figure standing in the doorway, a woman in a long black dress, her face hidden in shadow. She stood there for what felt like an eternity before gliding into my room. I was paralyzed with fear as she approached my bed. In the dim light filtering through my curtains, I could make out more details of her appearance. Her dress was Victorian in style, with intricate beadwork that caught what little light there was. But her face remained in shadow, as if the darkness was part of her very being. She reached out toward me with one pale hand, and I noticed her fingers were unnaturally long and thin, ending in sharp points that seemed more like claws than human nails. Just as she was about to touch me, my brother Tyler burst into the room, having heard my muffled whimpers of fear. The woman vanished, but the temperature in the room remained freezing for hours afterward. Research into the house's history revealed a tragic past. In the late 1800s, it had belonged to a sea captain's widow, who was known for wearing black long after the traditional mourning period had ended. Local legend said she would stand in the widow's walk for hours, scanning the horizon for her husband's ship, refusing to accept that he had been lost at sea. More disturbing were the rumors about her involvement in the local spiritualist movement. Some said she hosted seances in the house's parlor, attempting to contact her husband's spirit. Others whispered about darker practices, suggesting that her grief had driven her to explore more sinister means of bridging the gap between the living and the dead. We finally moved out when I was 20, after a series of increasingly violent phenomena. Objects would fly across rooms, doors would slam with enough force to crack their frames, and the sound of weeping would echo through the house at night. The final straw came when my brother James was pushed down the stairs by an invisible force, breaking his arm in 2 places. The house still stands on its rocky perch, watching over the sound. New owners have come and gone, none staying longer than a year. Sometimes, driving past on stormy nights, I see a light in the widow's walk window and a figure in black standing at the glass, still searching the horizon for something or someone who will never return. Yesterday marked our first step into what my father enthusiastically called our southern adventure. The house stood on one of Savannah's historic squares, its wrought iron balconies dripping with Spanish moss, its brick exterior weathered by centuries of subtropical storms. Like many homes in Savannah's historic district, it carried its history in every creaking floorboard and shadowed corner. The moment we crossed the threshold, something felt different. The grand entrance hall, with its soaring ceiling and elaborate plasterwork, seemed to whisper with echoes of past lives. My father, Marco, was ecstatic about the price, remarkably low for such a prestigious location. My mother, Emma, always more intuitive, touched the doorframe with hesitation before stepping inside. Strange things began happening immediately. The protected front door would open by itself, the heavy iron hinges creaking as if welcoming invisible guests. The grand door leading to the parlor did the same, its ancient wood groaning in protest. My father assumed it was the restoration work still being completed, but there were no workers present that day. My brothers Alex and David exchanged worried glances when we discovered the back of the property. Behind the formal garden lay a small grotto near a decorative pond, surrounded by massive live oaks. The space felt wrong somehow, as if the very air was heavier there. Even the local birds seemed to avoid it. Inside, we were amazed by what the previous owner had left behind. The house was like a museum: antique furnishings, Chinese porcelain, Japanese katanas mounted on walls, and countless paintings. Above the marble fireplace hung a massive taxidermied stag, its glass eyes reflecting lamplight in unsettling ways. The layout was peculiar, typical of antebellum architecture, but with strange additions. To the right of the entrance was a modern kitchen, and a stripped staircase led to the laundry room and back garden. The left side split into a fork-one path, leading to what would become my parents' room, the other stretching to what we dubbed the gallery room. The gallery was reached by a long hallway that felt endless at night. Adjacent to it was a peculiar bathroom, with an elongated mirror covering an entire wall, leading to my brother's room. The space made no architectural sense. You could somehow return to the front parlor through their closet, creating an impossible loop. The gallery room was always cold, even during Savannah's sweltering summers. Opening windows didn't help. The space remained freezing. We set up a foosball table, gaming systems, and exercise equipment there, but nobody wanted to stay long. The air felt thick, as if you were moving through invisible cobwebs. Everything changed the night. My father bought a documentary about Savannah's haunted history. Our neighbor's sweet Chihuahua, Brandy, was staying with us and suddenly began barking furiously at the kitchen wall. Her fur stood on end, her mouth foaming with fear. When I moved her to the laundry room, she just whined pitifully. That night, after the documentary ended, the presence made itself known. I was sleeping in my parents' room, unnerved by the strange atmosphere. Above the bed hung a painting of two children walking along a country road, a shadowy male figure following behind them. Around 3 a.m, we began hearing furniture moving across floors and chains rattling in the attic, accompanied by what sounded like someone calling a dog. The next direct encounter happened when I woke at midnight. The entire house was dark except for my parents' room, where I was sleeping. Through the open door, I could hear nails scratching along the walls, and an odd whistle, like someone calling an animal. The scratching grew closer, until I saw long, dark fingers curling around the doorframe, accompanied by an audible gasp. I pulled the covers over my head, trembling in terror. Later, we learned the house had belonged to an artist who had died by his own hand in our garage. He was a recluse who spoke to no one, though joggers would see him carrying art supplies at odd hours. Nobody knew about the little girl that my brother claimed to see, the one wearing an old-fashioned scarf who roamed near the pond. My mother, more spiritually inclined than the rest of us, performed a cleansing ritual with sage, asking the spirits to find peace. The atmosphere changed after that, but not entirely. The carpenters still reported seeing a girl near the pond, her face obscured by a strange scarf. They also uncovered something disturbing. The grotto contained a mass grave of animals, dogs, cats, geese, horses, and owls, all carefully arranged. Years later, my mother stayed home alone while Dad worked, and we were at school. She never experienced anything supernatural during those solitary hours, which somehow made the nighttime activities even more unsettling. The gallery room remained perpetually cold, and visitors would often ask about the little girl with the scarf, whom they'd glimpsed in the garden. The paintings the artist left behind still exist, stored away in a climate-controlled unit. Sometimes I wonder if they hold clues to what really happened in that house, why he chose to end his life there, who the little girl was, and what dark energy lingered in that grotto. But part of me fears that some questions are better left unanswered, some doors better left closed. The house still stands in Savannah's historic district, its iron balconies still draped with Spanish moss, its windows still reflecting the soft glow of gas lamps at night. Sometimes, passing by, I think I see movement behind those windows, a tall figure carrying an easel, or a small shape wearing a scarf, both of them trapped in an endless loop of their own tragic histories. The Green Mountain Recovery Center occupied an old Victorian mansion nestled in the Vermont wilderness. Last summer, during my stay there, I learned that some doors between worlds are better left closed. The facility itself was beautiful, all gabled roofs and wraparound porches, surrounded by maple trees that blazed with color in the autumn light. But beauty, I discovered, can mask terrible secrets. I shared a room with Morgan Delaney, a former art student with a talent for sketching shadow figures she claimed followed her around. Our other neighbors in the women's wing included Ashley Wright, whose tragic family history seemed to attract supernatural phenomena, and Raven Winters, who claimed to be sensitive to spiritual energies. Chris Peterson lived in the men's wing, his sardonic humor masking a deeper understanding of the paranormal world. One night, when the summer air hung heavy with approaching thunder, someone suggested we try to contact the other side. We were all in various stages of recovery, seeking escape from our personal demons. Perhaps that vulnerability made us perfect conduits for something darker. Morgan produced a Ouija board she'd bought from the general store in town, one of those mass-produced versions that glowed in the dark, its phosphorescent letters casting a sickly green light in our dimmed room. We gathered in the facility's old library, surrounded by leather-bound books and heavy velvet curtains. The room had once been the mansion's study, where, we later learned, the original owner had conducted seances in the late 19th century. 5 of us placed our fingers on the planchette myself: Morgan, Chris, Ashley, and Raven. At first, nothing happened, except the usual accusations of someone pushing the pointer. Then something changed. The planchette began moving with a fluid grace that felt nothing like human manipulation. It glided across the board as if floating on oil, spelling out coherent messages. The spirit identified itself as Emma, claiming to be Ashley's sister who had died in childhood. Ashley, tears streaming down her face, asked questions only her sister would know the answers to. The responses were unnervingly accurate. Suddenly, Raven began convulsing. Her eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and her body twisted in ways that seemed to defy anatomy. The sounds that came from her throat weren't human, not just pig-like squeals as some have described similar experiences, but deep, guttural noises that seemed to contain words from a language none of us recognized. The planchette went wild, whipping between letters so fast we could barely keep our fingers on it. Chris, who had been recording the letters, later showed us that they formed Latin phrases spelled backward. The temperature in the library plummeted, and we could see our breath in the summer air. When Raven started crawling toward the door in a crab-like motion, her limbs bent at impossible angles, it took 3 of us to stop her. She was surprisingly strong, fighting against us with inhuman force. All the while, the planchette continued its frenzied dance across the board, now spelling out Morgan's name repeatedly. We finally ended the session, but something had changed. The energy in the facility shifted. Doors would open and close by themselves. Objects would move when no one was looking. Residents reported hearing whispers in empty rooms, and several people complained of being touched by invisible hands. The next night, Morgan and I tried another session, hoping to understand what we'd contacted. The planchette immediately spelled out my name, then began violently moving between A and C. The air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. We could hear scratching sounds in the walls, and voices speaking in what sounded like ancient languages. The final session proved catastrophic. The board spelled out a series of numbers that, when decoded, matched the dates of deaths that had occurred in the mansion during its history as a tuberculosis sanatorium in the early 20th century. Then it began spelling painful over and over, the planchette moving with such force it nearly flew off the board. After that night, strange things began happening to each of us. Morgan started seeing dark figures standing over her bed at night. Ashley would wake up with unexplainable scratches. Raven refused to enter certain rooms, claiming they were filled with malevolent energy. Chris began having violent nightmares about being trapped in a tuberculosis ward. I started getting phone calls in the middle of the night, nothing but static and what sounded like distant screams. Even after changing my number multiple times, the calls continued. They only stopped when I finally left the facility, but sometimes I still hear that static in my dreams. The staff eventually found out about our sessions and brought in a local priest to bless the building. The atmosphere improved somewhat, but there remained a heaviness in certain areas, particularly the library. The Ouija board disappeared that night. We assumed someone had thrown it away. But weeks later, I found it under my mattress, the planchette pointing to Z. Today, the Green Mountain Recovery Center still operates, helping people fight their personal battles. But those of us who were there that summer know it houses other battles as well. Conflicts between worlds that we foolishly thought we could navigate. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake to the sound of static on my phone. And in those moments between sleep and waking, I swear I can hear voices speaking in that ancient, unknown language. Thornton Hall stands at the heart of Riverside Women's College. Its red brick walls rising 4 stories above the Massachusetts countryside. Built in 1922, it's the oldest dormitory on campus. Its Gothic Revival architecture, a testament to a time when women's education was still considered a radical notion. I never expected to find myself living there, let alone sharing space with someone who had called it home nearly a century ago. The trouble began during orientation week. Moving into a historic building, you expect certain quirks: creaking floorboards, temperamental radiators, windows that stick in humid weather. What you don't expect is to hear a piano playing at 3 in the morning from the common room, only to find the antique baby grand locked and covered when you investigate. My room was on the 4th floor, a corner suite I shared with Ember Clark, an art history major from Seattle. The space had original features that had survived decades of renovations: elaborate crown molding, a window seat overlooking the river, and built-in bookshelves that still bore the initials of previous residents carved into the wood. One name appeared more frequently than others: E.T., We initially joked that we were sharing our room with an extraterrestrial, but library archives revealed a different story. Edna Thornton had been one of the college's first students in 1922. A brilliant young woman studying mathematics at a time when such pursuits were considered unsuitable for ladies. The archives contained several photographs of Edna, a serious-looking girl with dark hair pulled back severely from her face, wearing the long skirts and high-necked blouses typical of the era. She had lived in our room during her senior year, but never graduated. According to college records, she died mysteriously in the spring of 1923. Our first clear encounter with Edna happened during midterms. I was studying late, fighting to keep my eyes open as I reviewed calculus formulas. The desk lamp flickered, and suddenly the temperature dropped so dramatically I could see my breath. Then I noticed something odd about my notebook. Equations were appearing on the page, written in a delicate, old-fashioned hand. They were correct solutions to problems I'd been struggling with for hours. Ember had her own experiences. She would wake in the night to find her art supplies rearranged, her sketches altered with techniques she hadn't learned yet. Once she left an unfinished drawing of the dormitory on her desk, only to find it completed the next morning in a style reminiscent of 1920s architectural renderings. We began to notice other patterns. The piano music we heard always came from the same piece, Debussy's Clair de Lune, which college records showed was performed at a memorial service for a student in 1923. Books would appear on our window seat, always open to passages about women's struggles for education and independence in the early 20th century. The most striking incident occurred during a late-night study session. Ember and I were discussing the women's suffrage movement for our American history class when we heard typing coming from the corner of the room. An old Underwood typewriter, part of the room's vintage Dacre, was clicking away by itself. The paper inside contained a first-hand account of a suffragette rally in Boston, signed E. Thornton, March 15, 1923. Further research in the college archives revealed more about Edna's story. She had been involved in the women's rights movement, writing passionate articles for the college newspaper about gender equality and educational access. Her death had officially been ruled an accident, a fall down the dormitory's marble stairs. But her friends had always suspected there was more to the story. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn to the common room by the sound of that familiar Debussy piece. This time, instead of finding an empty room, I saw her. Edna sat at the piano, her form translucent but distinct, wearing a long dark skirt and white blouse. As I watched, she turned to look at me, and I saw in her eyes a mixture of determination and sadness that made my heart ache. She began to speak, her voice sounding distant yet clear. They tried to silence us, you know, not just with words, but with force when necessary. Some things haven't changed as much as we'd hoped. Then she vanished, leaving only the lingering notes of Clair de Lune hanging in the air. That conversation led us to dig deeper into the circumstances of Edna's death. College newspapers from 1923 revealed that she had been preparing to publish an exposé about certain faculty members who were actively working to restrict women's roles in academia. The night she died, she had been carrying her typescript to the newspaper office. Ember and I began leaving our textbooks open on the window seat. Calculus, physics, philosophy, subjects that would have been considered inappropriate for women in Edna's time. We'd often return to find notes in the margins, encouraging comments in that same delicate handwriting we'd come to know. As the semester progressed, we came to understand that Edna wasn't a malevolent presence, but rather a guardian of sorts. She seemed to take particular interest in students studying traditionally male-dominated fields, offering subtle assistance and encouragement in her own unique way. Now nearing graduation, I sometimes sit at that old piano in the common room, playing Clair de Lune as the sun sets over the river. Sometimes I feel her presence beside me, this remarkable woman who refused to be silenced, who still watches over new generations of women pursuing their dreams. In these moments, I realize that some ghosts don't haunt us out of malice or regret they stay, to ensure that those who come after them have the opportunities they were denied. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.